Hey everybody, let's move on to week 14. This or last week we finished up talking about community policing and a couple of things that are interesting. I kind of am interested to see what happens with textbooks in the near future and how they treat community policing, whether or not it is still revered to be the absolute only way that the police can ever maintain a relationship with the public. You know, if you read that and actually looking at our discussion board, you know, most commentators and students feel that community policing um, is extremely important in maintaining a relationship, you know, with the public. Um, And I posted on the news item something I'd like you to look at, and that's a Gallup poll. And it shows that in 2017, the police had come back to an average, 25-year average of, since Gallup had been doing polls, as to how the public viewed them. And you know, that comes from up from a time when it was fairly low. But it can be traced pretty closely to all of the different controversial actions by the police in the past few years. You know, their policing is, you know, it's a tough job, and you get put in bad positions. And it doesn't help when you have situations like the one that I mentioned was Trayvon Martin. Many students are pretty certain that this was a police action where the police unjustifiably killed Martin for walking through a neighborhood after going to get a bag of Skittles. And it just, you know, first off, it's just not true. The police were not involved in that. George Zimmerman was a worked or lived in the neighborhood and decided to confront him because of his suspicious nature in Zimmerman's eyes. And once the fight started, Zimmerman ended up shooting Martin. And we know there was a fight because Zimmerman had some dents and dings. Whether or not this was sufficient for the level of force that was used was something that the jury had to decide, and the jury did, you know, find in Zimmerman's favor. Of course, he's gone on to other issues. Some things I'd like you to think about from community policing. First off is if you do community policing the way that it was envisioned by those that put it together, or that started talking about it with broken windows, and then moving on to the eras of policing and the academic approach to it, was that the police would do less, enforcement, less random patrol, that they would do more contacts with the community. Officers would be taken out of cars and they would be walking beats in cities, in towns, which can work if you have a concentrated downtown area. It works in some areas. You look at the Spectrum in Irvine. If you've ever been there, or if you haven't, it's an outdoor mall kind of a situation with like Nordstrom's and Macy's used to be there. They've left because of poor sales, and a bunch of other stores that attract quite a few people, and it's amazing the actual number of people that walk through, and especially in the summertime when the weather's nice. In the evening, it's a very pleasant walk. Big, bunch of theaters, lots of places to eat. So it does get a lot of people coming to it. Now, when it first opened, it had a series of bars that caused tons of trouble, that led to multiple police contacts, and the cops were going out there all the time. So eventually it was staffed with as many as 4 officers, 3 officers and a supervisor in the evenings, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. And if you think about that, 3 officers, putting 1 person in a car, 3 officers can police a really large area if they're in separate vehicles. But these 3, because of calls for service and fights and all kinds of shenanigans, spent the time there. So that's one idea, is that the manpower and the staffing is costly. The second thing is that the phone continues to ring, meaning that people call the police and they want to report the kid's bike got stolen. And they expect not only the police to come out and take a report, but there to at least be something done on the surface to try to find that bike. Cops will drive around. Doesn't happen, but they'll do those kind of things in an effort to recover the bicycle. And then, if the bike's recovered with somebody on top of it, well then, arrest them and pursue that. That doesn't stop though. Crime still occurs, and the larger goal for community policing is that it would people would stop calling because there'd be less crime. People would be self-policing, and people would provide information to police that would lead to the arrest of individuals. And then if you look at it from that standpoint, a person that gets arrested by the police, maybe eventually or at some point in time will go, oh gosh, no, okay, I was a knucklehead. But more than likely, for quite a while, they're not going to feel that way. They're going to think that they were selected for enforcement by the police, often for for bad reason, and that's going to hurt the community policing effort. So community policing, the goals still have a long ways to go to be achieved, and the police will continue as long as that's the direction that they're pushed in trying to make those things happen. So that being said, community policing is, it's costly, it's manpower intensive. Community policing is not at the present time satisfying the public because of the fact that they still get victimized and they still expect a response. When you talk to people and you ask them, or you find out that they were involved in some sort of criminal conduct as a victim, and they say, yeah, police were great, they were right there. They were there within 5 minutes. Well, of course, we know from earlier that rapid response to calls for service doesn't help unless it's within a couple of minutes, to arresting somebody. So you take officers away, you put them doing something else. That response to calls for service is going to be affected, and the perception of the effectiveness of the police will go down. So take a look at the Gallup poll. I think it's pretty interesting. This week we're going to talk about technology, and the first section of this is talking about the different stages of technology with policing. The idea of the early development of the automobile, and then eventually of portable radios you could mount in a car, and then widespread use of telephones. It wasn't that long ago that not every house, every room, every pocket, had a phone in it. It was, a phone was a luxury item. as as those things started to come online, some cars, as they became affordable, Henry Ford, um, that get applied to policing, fairly quickly. The radios, when I first started in policing back in the when I first started in policing, it was not uncommon for officers to go out in the field without a handheld radio. That was a luxury item because they were really expensive. And, to get a pack set that worked, um, that had the battery was going to run the whole life of the shift, and that was not a guaranteed item. I remember, making car stops and turning on the outside speaker of the police radio so that as I was dealing with the person that stopped, I could hear what was going on. Then, with the rise of the automobile, traffic became a big issue, and that became one of the focuses of police departments. Even away from the idea of of crime, traffic was something that was a large issue, and development of traffic signals for intersections, which freed up officers because if you look at a lot of, if you look at vintage film of streets, you'll often see a police officer directing traffic because of the lack of traffic signals and their sheer expense. The next stage is the stage of 911 and civilianization. Early on in policing, civilians maybe, had a clerical function, dealt with making sure that reports were put in the proper file, that court packages, meaning, the court documents were sent off, for the morning's processing through the court system. And then maybe some front desk personnel. But in a lot of agencies, and you look at, a great example is New York. New York has a lot of positions that are manned by police officers that either aren't competent to work the field, or there's an issue with with them being hurt, and they have to, they want to work, and they have to go someplace. So maybe they get put in dispatch, maybe they get put as a desk officer, in those areas. When I first started in policing, I was one of the first people in the country as a civilian to be put out in the field and to deal with traffic collisions and and take reports. It's a great job. One of the advantages of civilianization is the ability for an agency to see potential future candidates and see if they're going to fit within the organization, if they exhibit good characteristics, good backgrounds, things of that nature. And it's a very effective way. If you're thinking about law enforcement and you can get into an agency as a front desk person, a CSO, community service officer, maybe taking reports, or some other function within the police department, or civilian traffic investigator if agency has it. Really think about that and pursue it, because usually it pays pretty well, and now you can look in the agency, and I really suggest this too for women, because you get to see, is the agency a bunch of knuckle-dragging Neanderthals? Or are you going to go in and be respected for your abilities? Some agencies are outstanding in how they hire women and minorities, and how they treat those people. And that's a good way to get a look at it, especially if you go with a discriminating eye. Also in this era was the beginning of the rise of computers, and computers for reports, for capturing data, for starting to analyze data, crime data, on a on a statewide basis, taking a 8.5 by 11 card and filling in bubbles that then go into a old style computer that would read the cards and then produce raw data for whoever was going to analyze it. The fourth session or stage is the stage of computer-aided dispatch, the use of data terminals inside of police cars, computers in police cars. The imaging of people, biometrics, and DNA. DNA has really caused quite a stir. I mean, you talked about it, and talked about people being found to not have committed crimes. Really an interesting process. Crime analysis is the next area in this section. And crime analysis, okay, so you're thinking maybe rolling around with a drunk at 3 o'clock in the morning. Well, that person's trying to take your gun and kill you isn't your idea of a good time. Totally understand that. But you want to be in police work and you want to solve crimes. You might think of crime analysis. Difficult jobs to get because there are more and more people that are interested in crime analysis, but it's something that you might consider exploring. Cal State Fullerton has a very solid certificate program. Most agencies that have crime analysts or crime analysis units will take on interns so that you can take a look at it. Some are paid, some are unpaid. I was fortunate enough to have several students go through the crime analysis unit where I worked because I was such a strong believer in crime analysis. So crime analysis does a couple of things. The first thing that they will do is they analyze data, and that data goes from a flow. Officer writes a report in the field for a crime. He turns it in. It is read by a supervisor or a report approval person. It's approved and then sent to records. Records will then input the data from the report into another database. The time of day, suspect characteristics, victim characteristics, location, type of crime, type of weapon, type of instrument used, a vast array of information. That goes into a computer system that can be tapped by crime analysis. It also prepares the reports for the federal government, also prepares reports for the state government. And these are what's the crime rate, kind of reports. So with that, crime analysis will come up with two different types of overall products. The first is strategic analysis. And that means what kind of crime problems is that city having? What kind of resources are available? And putting it really short, do the police need more resources? And that information can be used talking to city council about their particular, the city's particular needs, and try to convince council for either more money for equipment, more money for officers, and it gives upper management some information upon which to plan the development of the agency. Next thing is tactical analysis. Tactical analysis is about solving crimes. The data is only as good as what gets into the system. It must be timely, it must be relevant, and it must be reliable. From that information, an officer may go to crime analysis and say, hey, I took a burglary from a residence the other night, and I noticed that the suspect unscrewed the light bulb for a motion detector in the backyard. right by the point of entry. The point of entry was unusual because it looks like the window was punched open, and then the suspect reached inside and unlocked a single bolt, single cylinder deadbolt. Maybe there's some geography about it. Maybe it backs up onto a parking lot, or park, or school, or something of that nature. And pool furniture was put up against the fence to give the suspect an escape, or something similar. A whole bunch of things in MO can be important. Crime analysis can take that information, run a query through the data system, and now they find out that not only do we have a burglary taken by this officer in this area, but we have 10 other burglaries with similar MO factors throughout the city. And it goes from being another residential burglary to now a series of burglaries, and that calls for some problem-solving approach. One of the tenets of community policing, so that you may get detectives together with crime analysis, with patrol officers, analyzing the problem, putting it through a SARA analysis, and then coming up with a plan of attack on the problem. The crime analysis may also just provide data, raw data. These are the crimes that we had last week, and these are the locations of the crimes. So you can see these are the arrests we had, what the arrests were for, where they occurred. And that'll really stand out, especially when you start dealing with longer terms, maybe over 6 months, and you see that you're getting domestic violence arrest at a particular residence, particular apartment complex, robberies at a particular strip mall. That'll start to show up, and it can affect how officers approach their beats and what they're really looking for. Another thing that you'll see, for those of you that are currently sitting through or will sit through theory and thinking, my gosh, how will I ever use this? Well, crime analysis uses theory quite a bit. Routine activity theory is one of the major theories that crime analysis uses to look at particular problems. So you're going to get a chance to use theory, and that class won't be the total waste you may have thought. Another thing is geographic profiling. Geographic profiling came out of Canada. A police officer who was getting his PhD at Simon Fraser, he took some information that was started by an academic and really developed this into an active crime-solving method, and a method which takes and focuses your pool of suspects based on geography. It is used with crimes in a series, usually about 5 or more crimes, and then a really strict analysis, includes site visits, a strict analysis of what the site looks like and when and where and how a crime happens. Getting back to the burglaries with the backyard, do you have that easy escape route? Is the person trying to cover their their entry or their activities by unscrewing light bulbs? Is it a gate-guarded community? All of those things may put together enough to link crimes together. So with that, geographic profiling, really interesting process. I've used it on series as little as 5 and as many as 140 crimes. And the 140 crimes were throughout the county. And once you looked at it from the crime analysis and geographic profiling vision, you could see and make some pretty good guesses as to where the perpetrator lived, where the crimes, where he worked, and where he did some recreation. It was pretty interesting. So from that, the next thing that comes up was in the 1990s, an approach to management theory came along known as CompStat. Most police managers handle personnel issues, and they're looking at things maybe from a strategic analysis standpoint. With the advent of community policing, they may be out trying to make connections with the business community in partnership kind of aspects, and that's going to be their focus. Well, with CompStat, what happened was a series of police leaders, Jack Maples, Bill Bratton on the East Coast, Jack Maples in Boston, Bill Bratton in New York, came up with this concept of CompStat. And CompStat is a really effective way to get managers to think about crime. And what happens, especially if you have a large agency where you can actually put somebody, if you need to demote them without actually demoting them, you get together with whoever is going to run CompStat, whether it's the chief, whether it's somebody, a subordinate of the chief's, and for a meeting. And in this meeting, the commanders for the areas are quizzed about what's going on in their area. And as crimes come up, what are you doing about it? What is the process behind solving this crime? And it puts a ton of pressure on commanders, and they hate it. They'd rather be doing the other stuff that they were doing as opposed to dealing with the CompStat issues. And if the chief thinks that you're not doing a good enough job, you're not aware enough, you're not encouraging your people to come up with solutions, people are getting demoted and sent to other areas in the department. So they may be in charge of paper clips down in the harbor, as opposed to running a division in a particular area in a city. CompStat's a really good thing. Downside of CompStat, managers hate it. And then secondly, a lot of it has to do with, or is approached with, aggressive policing. So you have a prostitution problem and it's on this particular street. And you have the associated issues. You have people that are purchasing and using drugs in the area. You have people having sex in cars or elsewhere. You have people that are walking the streets and urinating in public and all kinds of really swell things you don't really think about when you think about prostitution. So one of the ways to solve that problem is heavy enforcement. But we've learned from our discussions on Terry stops that a lot of people don't like this idea of heavy enforcement. So you get the conflict with the community. Next issue we see this week is cameras. Tons of cameras around. In England is a great example. In London, you can't walk in pretty much anywhere without being on a camera, and cameras that are run by the police. Great for solving crimes. Also kind of limits your ability to move around without people being able to track your movements. Kind of one of the things we like here in the United States. But the United States is getting more and more that direction also, where there is tons of cameras every place you go, many run by the government. Look at intersections. As you sit at a red light today or tomorrow, look at the signal masts, and you'll see cameras there. Kind of cool, because when crimes happen, I mentioned in a discussion board post that our poor dispatchers, truly it was awful for them, watched a domestic violence murder at an intersection. They had been called to 911 by the victim. who was getting beat up as the car was driving down the street, gets to this intersection. They find the car. They're calling the cavalry. Units are rolling code 3 to it, and the guy kills the woman. All in video. Good to solve the murder, but there's a question about the civil liberty in that area. License plate readers are another big technological advancement where, it's software in a police car that as cars go by, it reads the license plate, pulls up the registration information, and you see if there's a stolen on it or any want on the vehicle. Talk about the legality of those things. Look at the use of drones. The drones can be the size of a bug now that have video on them, and can be in a lot of different places that will borderline, privacy, private areas. DNA is going to be, I think it'll be a really big issue in this Golden State Killer or East Area Rapist. I knew the person's the East Area Rapist. I think it's going to be a big deal in that particular case, because the government got access to people's DNA from some other resource, and did so, to the best of my knowledge at this point, without a warrant. So you give your DNA to one of these websites or companies, to maybe search your ancestry. Well, now they've got your genetic code. And as you can see from this case, a remote relative can lead the police to someone who has committed crimes. So we'll see if that's going to be something that, for the government to get, they're going to have from the Fourth Amendment, particularized suspicion, and before this information can be released. The last area that I want to talk about really quick, dispatch with the MDC, mobile data computers, and then also computer-aided dispatch. And what happens in computer-aided dispatch is dispatcher gets an incoming call, inputs the call, the location, type of call, background information onto a computer screen, pushes a button. It gets sent to the primary dispatcher. Primary dispatcher then gets a suggestion from the computer of the nearest unit to send based on the location and the priority. So it's a low priority call. Call can be held for the beat officer to handle. The beat officer is busy, then the same thing will happen, but we'll send the nearest unit to handle the call, to get to the call, and at least begin the process to start to bring order. Computer-aided dispatch, a lot of good possibilities, from that. Most agencies now will have a large room with their dispatch components, with a map, GIS map on the wall showing where units are, that can be queried as to what those units are doing, and then calls that are pending, and the priority of those calls, and then what area the calls belong in. Some really, good organizational issues. I remember as a young little itty-bitty police officer that I was writing reports after work one night, and on overtime, of course, and the call comes in of a guy shooting kids. Well, what had happened was there were 2 or 3, knuckleheads that were drunk are walking behind this guy's house, and they're making noise, and then the other knucklehead inside starts cranking off rounds at him, thinking that they were breaking into his property. Bad deal. Well, I went into dispatch to help the only dispatcher that was there, and I would answer the phone, I would take a card, I would write the information on the card, I would timestamp it, and then give it to the dispatcher. She would take it, she'd timestamp it, and then would put it on a rack of cards indicating what was going to be, or so what was holding, what was pending. And then she would know that and she would make selections. Well, of course, the place went insane for an hour as all the neighbors were calling in and this and that. And then officers were calling in and detectives and requests from the field for this and that. And so you're quickly overwhelmed. And, we worked in dispatch on just that one call for 5 or 6 hours, just trying to help the person keep up. Now computer-aided dispatch really helps with that. Okay, so that's going to be this week, and we're closing in. So make sure you get your papers done and get those turned in. Don't lose any extra points now because we're really getting down to it. With that being said,